Hello everyone, I hope you're having a great Mystikcon so far. Welcome to my talk, 5 ways I got caught on your network before lunch. A little bit about me first. My name is Daniel Duggan. I'm the director of 0 Point Security. I go online by Rastermouse. I blog at rastermouse.me and offensivedefense.co.uk. I have a background in pen testing and adversary simulation. Spent most of my career in the UK government and in the finance sector. These days I'm directing my own company, which we do online cybersecurity training. If you're interested in checking that out, visit the website, 0pointsecurity.co.uk. Also very happy to be sponsoring part of this conference, so I think we're giving away some prizes for the CTF. So if you want a chance to win a free course subscription, make sure you play along. So the inspiration for this talk was these two blog posts really. So this one in particular, top 5 ways I got DA on your network before lunch by Adam Tosha or Tosha. You can go read that at this URL. And then I found a similar one, Domain Admin in 30 Minutes by Darcidius. And, there are lots of this type of content online, articles, blogs, tutorials and that kind of thing about how easy it is to get DA. So if you look at Adam's post, it's basically his top 5 attack techniques, and then this DA in 30 minutes is a bit of a top to bottom story about how this person and their team breached an environment and then got DA, obviously within 30 minutes. The kind of the theme behind these posts and a lot of others is that how easy it can be to get DA. Just do this, run some tools, run some commands, blah, 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 and then you win. And although sometimes that is the case, it's also not the case the whole time. So I thought I would flip these ideas on their head, which is how we got to 5 ways to get caught. So the objective of the talk is to have a look at some common tradecraft that people do, and we're not going to go into too much detail about indicators and logs and things, but we're going to have a brief look at those things. What if you run this tool or you run this command, what logs get generated and how a defender's detecting those and picking those up. And then we're going to take those, and then I'm going to provide some OPSEC safe alternatives. So if you're not familiar with the term OPSEC, I've got a really basic definition here, and I've put if friendly actions can be observed by enemy intelligence. So in this context, we're the friendlies, even though we're the attackers, and the enemy are the defenders. So really what we're saying is we need to get from A to B, so we want to get DA or we want to do whatever we're going to do, but we want to do it in a way that we're not going to get caught. So we need to be as quiet and as stealthy as we can be. The offenders that I'm going to go through in this talk are these 5 here. Shell commands, Kerberoasting, Pass-the-Hash, Overpass-the-Hash, and DCSync. So we'll get into each one as we go. The lab I use to collect the telemetry information is Chris Long's detection lab. If you go to his GitHub, you'll see that there are lots of different ways that the lab can be deployed. I use the Snap Labs one because it's just really easy. You just click a button and you've got it. But if you want to get hold of this lab and spin it up, you can go through the examples in this talk, and you can basically replicate what I'm going to show you. So shell commands. So these are typically commands that you execute through the operating system's default shell. On Windows, that's going to be command prompt most likely, or maybe PowerShell. And on Linux, you have Binshare, Bash, ZSH, Fish, and all of those others. There are two flavors of that. So I've got what I've called one-off execution, where so for example, for command prompt, you will run cmd with the /c and then followed by the command. And what that does is it spawns command prompts, it runs the commands that you specified, and then when that command is finished, the command prompt closes. So you can imagine that you just run a command and then you get the output. Another one is this spawn once and attach to the standard in-out error. So processors have these standard streams where they output and take in information. And what you can do is you can create a process once, attach to its standard in and standard out, and then continuously pump commands in and get results out without having to spawn a new instance of that process every time. So I'm using Sliver here, which is a C2 framework written around Golang. So you can see that we have a session here, and I use the shell command to drop into a shell. Now, Sliver is quite interesting that it tells you, hey, this is bad OPSEC, do you want to do it? So for this, we're going to say yes. And then this uses that spawn once method. So it creates a process and it gives us the PID here, 7660. And then we drop into this kind of pseudo shell situation here where we can it looks like that we have a command prompt here, so we can type commands and get the output. Other frameworks like Metasploit Framework do this as well. That's how their shell command works. Other things like Covenant and Cobalt Strike are different. They use the cmd/c. But the telemetry, the logs that I'm about to show you are the same for each. So it doesn't actually matter really which method you use. You can still detect it in the same way. So if Sysmon is running on the system, Sysmon is brilliant because it's free. And if you're not running it, you probably should be. So Sysmon has a process create rule. And I've taken some of that log output here. So we can see that the process ID that was started was 7660 and the image was PowerShell. It gives you the user as well. So this is the Vagrant user that the detection lab uses by default. And it also gives us the parent. So the parent PID was 5016 and the parent image was sliver.exe, which I just dropped on the desktop. So that's my implant payload. We can go ahead and have a look at another process create rule. And this one was whoami. So when you run whoami, it actually spawns a process whoami.exe. Again, it tells us the user, and the parent process ID in this case was 7660, which is PowerShell. So there are some sort of security products as well. They can plot like nice graphs and things for you, and little like workflow type diagrams. So you could see that sliver.exe would spawn PowerShell, and then PowerShell would spawn whoami. And then for every command that you run in PowerShell, you would see another process creation event. And this rule name at the top here, these map to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So this just happens to be T1033. And the technique name is user discovery. So running whoami is not something that users do all that frequently, only attackers do. So if you go to Google and you search how to enumerate windows or whatever, you will get a big old list. So we have whoami, hostname, all of the various net commands, ipconfig, netstat, netsh, which is the Windows firewall utility, root, task list, WYMIC, and system info. Now, all of these things they're just not run by users particularly frequently, especially users who work in like typical back office roles, HR roles, finance roles. They're not going to be running these. They're just not. So as soon as a defender sees all of those process creates for, all of these, particularly in a short length of time, they're going to be saying, hey, this user, maybe they've been compromised. And they're going to go and start their investigation. So what are the alternatives to shell commands? Well, native C2 commands are pretty abundant, and they typically leverage operating system and language APIs. They don't spawn processes. So Sliver, again, is the example here, has a whoami command, it has an ifconfig command, it has a netstack command, and it has others. And these give you the same information as the aforementioned shell commands, but they don't spawn processes, they use APIs. So that means that you can run all of these and you're not going to get those Sysmon events. So number 2 is Kerberoasting. Now, everyone loves Kerberoasting. Pretty much the first thing most people do when they get a foothold is run Kerberoast. And the tool I'm using to demonstrate this is Rubeus. Because it's written in .NET, you can use these execute assembly style commands in C2 frameworks, and these allow you to execute .NET assemblies in memory, so you don't have to drop them to disk. These are very popular right now. And the same thing, pretty much everyone does is just run Rubeus and then Kerberoast. What Rubeus will do then is it will enumerate all of the users in the domain, and it will look for users where their service principal names are not null. So this is an indicator that those user accounts are being used as part of Kerberos authentication for a service. And by default, like I said, it will just roast every single one. Now, in the detection lab, I only created one user, so we only get one result. But you can imagine in large domains, you're going to have lots of services. These can be in the hundreds, sometimes maybe even thousands. And what people will do is just roast them all, copy them all into a text file, and then start running them through Hashcat or John. And then any passwords that they crack, they then go and they look at, I now have the password for these accounts. Are these accounts useful to me? What can I actually do with them? So I've highlighted the first fallacy of just roasting every account at the same time. We can see that this user here, the username is honey svc or honey service. The service is fake service, and the PC is fake PC. So the interesting thing about service principal names is that the service itself doesn't have to exist, nor does the computer. You can pretty much put any arbitrary string in the service principal name field of a user account, and that will appear as a service principal name. And because this is clearly fake, it will never ever be used in the domain. And when you Kerberoast an account, what you're actually doing is requesting service tickets for those services, and that generates a 4769 event. A Kerberos service ticket was requested. Now, the events themselves are actually a lot bigger than this, but I've just pulled out the relevant information. So you can see the account name. This is raster win domain. So this is my domain account that I was using to run the implant at the time. So this raster account is requesting a service ticket, and the service name is honey service. And obviously, if Honey service is fake, it's not a real service, you will never ever see Kerberos service ticket requests for a service that doesn't exist. The only way you see them is when someone is dicking around doing things like Kerberoasting. So this is a really, high fidelity way to detect those kinds of activities. You also have other indicators like those listed here. So you have the volume of 4769s from a single user in a short time frame. So you can imagine if you're at work, you're on your PC, you're using services in your domain. So you might be accessing a file share or maybe a SQL database or whatever it is. But you're only going to be using a handful at the same time. You're not going to be using every single service in the domain. And so when you Kerberoast and you request a service ticket for every single service in the domain, you're going to see a spike in those requests. And one user requesting requesting tickets for every service pretty much within 1 second is clearly very anomalous. You also have users requesting tickets for services they've likely never used before. So we go back to that example of people working in HR or finance. Somebody working in finance is only going to be using finance systems, whatever it is that they need to do their job. As soon as that user starts requesting service tickets for, services that run, things that are in completely different departments and that have nothing to do with them, that's also very anomalous. So there are a couple of ways there to detect that mass Kerberoasting relatively easily. So the takeaway there is just to not Kerberoast everyone at the same time. What you want to do is do some enumeration first. So you can use AD type enumeration tools to search for users where the SPN is not null, which is pretty much what Rubeus does in the first instance anyway. But then what you want to do is review those results in just querying for accounts that have a service principal name does not Kerberoast them, so that's fine. And then you can start looking through the accounts. And there are some attributes that you might want to pay attention to. So the first is, well, does the SPN even make sense? So in my example, I was using fake service, fake PC. Well, I guess if you saw that, you'd probably think that's a bit suspicious. I won't touch it. You have other things like admin account. So an admin account can be 0 or 1. Some enumeration tools will enum this, and if it's 1, it makes it look like it's a privileged account, so that makes it more attractive for you to go after. And then you have these others like account age, description, is it in any domain groups, when was the password last set, does it have a logon count, and you need to look at these and kind of get your spidey sense going. There's not like a golden rule to say, well, if the logon count is 0, then it's a honey token or anything like that. You just need to use your wits and make a deduction there. In particular, the account description, what I've seen a lot of places do is for a member of staff to request an account be created in the domain, they have to raise some sort of service ticket to do it. So, through your help desk or things like that. And then when the account is created, that ticket number is put in the description, so that later on somebody can go back for audit purposes, let's say, and say, well, this ticket was created for this reason, and it will say. So if you have access to their ticket system and you can go and look up a ticket number, it may well say that, hey, this account is for X service, blah, 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 or it may say this is just a fake account. You never know. So when you've done your enumeration and you feel pretty safe that you have some accounts that you want to Kerberoast, Rubeus has several filters that you can use to narrow that down. So you can roast by a specific service principal name. You can roast by a particular username. You can roast all the accounts in a specified OU. And then this LDAP filter here, you can specify any generic LDAP filter. So if you're a whiz with LDAP, you can write your own filters, and then the results of that filter gets passed to the actual Kerberoasting part. So that's a much better approach than just Kerberoasting every account in the domain. Right, Pass-the-Hash is really popular. It was such a great piece of tradecraft for a long time. And what people would typically do is you get local admin on a machine, and then the first thing that they do is run logon passwords. Logon passwords was good in the past because it would dump plain text credentials. You don't tend to get the plain text credentials anymore on modern Windows, but you do get the user's NTLM hash. Of course, you can take that hash and try and crack it offline to recover their password, but if they've got a super strong password and you're not going to crack it, Pass-the-Hash became really popular because you can just use their NTLM hash like a password. You don't need to crack it. And so what people do is they use secure LSA, and this is using Mimikatz, but secure LSA, Pass-the-Hash. You give it the user, the username, the domain name, and the NTLM hash. Mimikatz by default will spawn an instance of command prompt, and then from that instance of command prompt it gets like stuffed with the user's creds, and then as soon as you try and access a resource across the network, it just magically works. Now in the Mimikatz output there's this little line here that maybe you never paid attention to, but it says that the LSA process is now read-write. So what's that all about? Well, Mimikatz Pass-the-Hash, part of what it does is it has to patch LSASS. And Sysmon has got you covered here. There is a process access rule. So it says here that the source process, so the application opening that handle, was PID 4580, and it was Mimikatz.exe. Now, yeah, Mimikatz is running on disk here, but even from, if you were running a Mimikatz like reflectively or some magic way through a C2 tool or anything like that, it would still, pop up as the source, probably being, like in my case, it would be like sliver.exe. And the target process, PID, was 820, and the target image was LSASS, and it gives you the access that was granted. Now, in like modern Windows, modern AV, modern EDRs, touching LSASS is like signing your own death warrant, really. You do not want to be touching LSASS. And this is fundamentally how this style of Pass-the-Hash works. There is actually no like real alternative to that. So this command here, you just can't run. Don't do it. If you need to leverage the NTLM hash, the better way to do it is remotely through a proxy or a SOX proxy. So here's an example of me using Proxychains and WimiExec, which is from Impacket. You give it the domain, the username, the target machine, and then the NTLM hash. And then what all that will do is it will trigger a bunch of NTLM authentication logs, but you don't get the LSASS patching. This looks like a legit NTLM remote logon authentication type process. Of course, there are implications around that because most modern Windows uses Kerberos for authentication. So if you see old NTLM authentication going on in the domain, then that in itself is quite suspicious. Some places are even going as far as to disable NTLM authentication altogether, so even this wouldn't work in that case. So really, any type of credential theft with NTLM, or the NTLM hash, is going away. So that leads on to Overpass-the-Hash. And so this is a kind of like the next step up from what I just said, because Overpass-the-Hash is a process by which you can take the NTLM hash of a user and request Kerberos tickets. And Rubeus has us covered there. It has an ask TGT, and you give it the username, the domain, and the NTLM hash, and you can just say pass the ticket. So that it will ask the domain controller for a TGT for the user, and it will automatically pass that ticket into your current logon session. And then here, if you're a domain admin, then you can just magically just go, dir the $C drive, and you have remote access. So that's a way to use an NTLM hash without having to do pass the hash either on a local machine or through a proxy, but it still allows you to use Kerberos authentication. So again, you're not using NTLM authentication at all. Now the problem here, because there's always a gotcha, is that requesting TGTs generates another event, which are 4768s, and this is a Kerberos authentication ticket was requested. Now you get these all the time. Whenever a user logs on to the domain, they always request a TGT automatically, and Windows always stores it in the user's logon session. And this is how modern Windows is now doing single sign-on everywhere. So you can just log on once, you can access file shares and other services without having to re-enter your password all the time. So in itself, these 4768s are not a problem. What is a problem is this ticket encryption type down here. And this here is 0x17, which is RC4. And RC4 is a legacy encryption type that is only really supported in Windows now for backwards compatibility. If you log onto a modern Windows domain and you have a look at the TGT that was requested by your login, you will actually see that the ticket encryption type is 0x12, and that is AES. And so therefore, by requesting a TGT with an NTLM hash, you're actually generating these anomalous events. So even though they're all 4768s, the encryption type is different. So you're generating these with a weaker encryption type, and that is pretty easy to spot. So the alternative to this is actually very easy. It's just don't use NTLM. Don't use the user's NTLM hash. So that habit that you've got about running logon passwords to get NTLM hashes, that is what you need to get away from. So Mimikatz has another command in secure LSA called eKeys, which are Kerberos encryption keys. And you can see in this example, I do get the RC4 HMAC. So this is this FC52. This is the older NTLM hash. And then directly above it, we can see that we have an AES 256 key. And this is the one we want. This is the new habit that you need to get into. And then when we do ask TGT with Rubeus, everything is exactly the same, except instead of passing in the NTLM hash, we pass in that AES hash. and the resulting event, we get the correct encryption type. And this event here is pretty much indistinguishable in every single way from legitimate TGTs that get requested in the domain. And it's all from just using a different hash, but it can make a big difference. So DCSync is another interesting one, and you will often see people do, DCSync to request like the KRB TGT, so then they can make golden tickets and things like that. But they will always run it from like a compromised endpoint, like compromised workstation, a compromised server, or through a proxy. And if that proxy is running on, a workstation or another server, you're going to fall into this trap. So the replication traffic that DCSync uses only ever occurs between domain controllers, ever. So if you see, or if an organization sees replication traffic, AD replication traffic going from a machine that is not a DC to a DC, straight away you know that someone is doing DC sync or something like that. There is actually no way to get around that. You can only DC sync from a domain controller. Otherwise, that DC sync is going to get detected. And I couldn't get the actual log alert thing working in the detection lab, so I don't have an example of that. But DC syncing from a non-domain controller is going to get you caught, if they're looking, of course. So what are my key takeaways for the talk? Well, APIs are good, shell commands are bad. Never run a shell command unless you have to, especially for enumeration. If you can Google how to enumerate a box, defenders can do that, and then they have a list of commands that they're going to look for. Patching LSAS is bad, like always, or 99% of the time always. And that's not just true for pass-the-hash, that's true for like the mini dump type stuff. If NTLM authentication is required, use a pivot or a proxy. Otherwise, use Kerberos. NTLM is generally bad, AES is good. So if you're operating in any sort of modern Windows environment, you should be using AES keys and not NTLM hashes. And only ever DC sync from a domain controller. And then, of course, you've got the overhead and the risk of detection moving laterally to a domain controller. And it's one of those where like DC sync is really useful for obvious reasons, but it also comes with a heavy, heavy penalty if somebody is looking for that replication traffic. So those are my top 5 ways to get caught. I hope it was somewhat interesting, and I hope I've given you some ideas about how you can change your tradecraft to make it a little bit more stealthy. If you have any questions or queries or anything to do with the content of the talk, you can contact me on Twitter. That's the best place. I'm @_Rastermouse. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and thanks for listening this far, assuming you did.